So now that I finished the Red Alert series, I thought it might be a good time to talk about the different games, compare them to each other, how the series developed, and how I would rank each individual one. So that being said, let's start off with Red Alert 1. Now, I played Red Alert 1, the remastered edition, which is the one that was re released along with Tiberium Dawn a couple years ago, that has new graphics. Everything's just been updated. It's HD. You can run it in window mode now. The cinematics have been cleaned up. There's a better mission select screen, all that kind of stuff. It's been vastly improved. Now, of all the games on the list, this might actually be the hardest one to rank because it had Red Alert 1 had a lot of things going for it. I thought it had a very good story, particularly the Soviet story. It's definitely the most serious that Command and Conquer ever got. And I kind of like that. I kind of like the bleak outlook where you're having this apocalyptic Soviet invasion of Europe. It definitely felt a lot more realistic than the other games. That's not to say I don't like the camp of Red Alert 2 or 3, but I like that it had its own identity. It was kind of like the hard sci-fi to Tiberian Dawn's science fantasy. The balance in the game is something, even after playing it, I really don't know how to even rate the balance. In some ways, when I went into it, I thought the Soviets were going to be overpowered because they have heavy tanks and they have grenadiers and an air force and stuff like that. But as I played the game, I found that a lot of the stuff the Soviets had, like heavy tanks, are actually not that good because they actually have the same DPS as a medium tank. They're just more immobile. Um, the aircraft aren't particularly useful. They're incredibly fragile and they don't really have that high DPS. Grenadiers tend to explode on their own. It is as I went through it, I just more and more the Soviets didn't seem very good. Their navy is especially really lacking. The Allies, who I originally thought had a really bad roster, wound up having a significantly better one than I had remembered. In particular, light tanks are very good to spam en masse, and their navy really makes the difference in a lot of missions. Even just destroyers. Cruisers, I feel like the unit is not particularly well designed. I like the idea of having like an all powerful unit with ridiculous range, but I found its like accuracy was so bad that in the missions where you actually got cruisers, they were not very helpful because you would destroy things you weren't supposed to destroy. So I guess what I'm saying is when you look at it and you kind of compare and contrast the two arsenals, it's this strange case of where they feel both completely balanced and completely one-sided at the same time. So I guess that's a good thing. Each faction does kind of have its own unique play style, less so than in the future CNC games where they try to differentiate GDI and Nod and GDI and Nod and the Allies and Soviets. But I think overall, Red Alert, I'm going to put in the A tier. The only reason it's not going to go into S tier is the commando missions can get pretty rough. The facility missions that are timed, where you have to do commando missions inside, are just really miserable and really unlikable. There's also some missions where I just feel it's kind of unfair, the amount of just off map reinforcements the AI gets and the amount of money they cheat for. The More so than anything else, though, just the necessity of having to do naval actions. Well, cool in theory, in practice, having to load up. You're very slow loading, like transport thing with tanks one at a time, moving over, deploying the tanks, getting them off. Especially this is before you have base expansion release, so it's not like you can just build uh like a Sputnik or an emissary or some sort of outpost on the next island over and build units there. You have to do this long, slow process. And when I was replaying it, some of the missions I would just be sitting there for half the mission, waiting for the thing to load and unload. So while I think Red Alert was overall excellent game, I think it in many ways improved upon Tiberium Dawn and was a much more polished product. I think it does show its age to a certain extent. and just some of the flaws with mission design, particularly relating to the naval combat, and how some of the missions are structured might make you put it in the A tier. But then I can argue I'm playing a game from the mid to late 90s in 2024, and it's good enough that I'm actually able to compare it with stuff that's like over a decade later. So you know what? I'm gonna say it's flawed, more flawed than some of the other games we're gonna put on this list. But I think we're gonna put Red Alert One in the S tier. Um, Definitely one of the best RTSs of all time. Definitely one of the games that made Westwood. And while it has a lot of issues with it, and the pathfinding's still awful, if I'm judging this as like a game based on when it was released, it's definitely S tier. Next, we have Red Alert 2. I did not play Aftermath or Counter Strike, so we are not including those. So Red Alert 2 is probably the Command and Conquer game other than Tiberian Sun I remember the best as a kid. It's the one I played the campaign I think the most for. It's one that I just loved every aspect of. I loved the units, I loved the missions, I loved the atmosphere. It was a good balance of seriousness and camp. You had lots of memorable characters. Love President Dugin, love Premier Romanov. You obviously have Yuri, General Carvel. It was cool to have Eva in it as a like it not just an AI, but like an actual character. Red Alert 2 just did so many things right. It really took basically everything that was good about Tiberian Dawn and Red Alert 1 and just elevated it. Just gave it like the graphics, I still think don't even look terrible, but they look so much better than what the original ones were. You had all these creative unit designs, like the Apocalypse tank is cool, the Kirov is cool. Even just some of the allied units, like the Mirage tank, is really neat. The Prism tank is really neat. It was just a very creative game that they put a lot of time and effort into. The I think it's very well balanced. In how it's imbalanced. Like the Allies and the Soviets both have very defined play structures, and most of the units in the game have hard counters. Some units are definitely better than others, and some units I'm not even really sure why they're in the game. But playing the campaign, with the exception of a couple missions where you just don't have access to certain tech units yet, I very seldom felt like I was at a total disadvantage. Except for that one mission with the Pentagon, because I was stuck using Grizzlies and they hadn't given me um, Prism or Mirage tanks yet, which are kind of the basis of the Allied Land Army. But generally speaking, I find the two sides very well balanced. The Soviets have lots of great units. They have Apocalypse tanks. V3s are really good as well. I really like how their navy's designed, where they have like the big dreadnought with the heavy missiles and the attack subs, which more or less is what the Soviet Navy was like in real life. The Soviets are really cool. The Allies have two of my favorite, well, three of my favorite units in any CNC game. GIs are an awesome, just base infantry unit. I couldn't really use them as much when I was playing through it, just because I the way I was playing it, it was hard to do micro, so I couldn't really use it that much. I love Mirage tanks and Prism tanks. They're both just awesome. Prism tanks are so much fun. Mirage tanks are so much fun. They are, I would say, actually kind of balanced by the fact that they have no armor and they're just glass cannons, which makes them kind of a good counter to like the Soviet stuff, which has armor, but is less specialized, or rather is just more kind of a brute force unit. But I found the unit roster was really good for both sides. The campaign was great. I think it's of the Red Alert games, it definitely had the best design campaign. Uh, Most of the missions felt fair. There wasn't really that many cases where I felt like the game was cheesing me, or it was trying to balance itself by just giving the AI a ridiculous amount of off-map reinforcements, or stuff like that. If there was time limits, I found the time limits were pretty fair. The missions were really well designed. There's a lot of just memorable missions, like off the top of my head. I love the one where you're in Mexico with the counterfeit ghetto prism towers. The one with the Cuban Missile Crisis one where you have to chrono shift your guys across is a lot of fun. Pearl Harbor is fun. The Missouri one where you have to like infiltrate and blow up the psychic beacon is fun. The Alamo one is cool. It had by far, I think, the best commando missions. Like I actually liked the commando missions that I actually looked forward to playing some of them. Like the one with Tanya where you have to go in and blow up the nuclear silos. So Red Alert 2 to me is probably gameplay wise and just overall the best CNC game. So it's going to go into the top of A tier. Um, it's not my favorite. Overall, I there's another game in this series that I'd rate a bit higher than that, mostly because of story and atmosphere. But in terms of it being a just an overall package with a great campaign, great balance, nothing to really complain about, I'm gonna give Red Alert 2 a spot in the S tier. Next, we have Yuri's Revenge. This is what everything an expansion pack should have. We have new units, we have a new faction, and we have two full new campaigns. Granted, the campaigns aren't as long as the base game, but it is an expansion pack after all. And we have a logical story progression. It's campy, it's kind of goofy, but it's also kind of serious enough. So I think it captures very much the feel of Red Alert 2, albeit you can tell they definitely had a smaller production budget for it. Most of the new units I think are actually pretty good and they fill niches. Guardian GIs are a unit that I can never like understand why they weren't in the original game because the Allies really needed an infantry anti-air, anti-vehicle unit. So that I think really helps their arsenal out a lot. Robot tanks were interesting. I don't really get the point of them. They were probably one of the less good new units they added in. They also added in the Battle Fortress, which should have been a good unit, but we'll get into why I don't think it was, at least not in campaign. The Soviets mostly got two new units. They got Boris, who I think is really cool. They did a good job of giving the Soviets a commando unit that is equal but very different to Tanya. That has some benefits that Tanya lacks and some drawbacks that Tanya has is able to fill. So I think Boris was a good addition. The Siege Chopper, and if you watch my playthrough, you will appreciate this. I think was a hole in the Soviet arsenal, particularly in Yuri's Revenge, because of Guardian GIs and because of the Gatling turrets. Air got massively nerfed, and missiles got massively nerfed as well. So in some missions where I would normally use V3s to try to break up um, like defensive fortifications, you just can't do that anymore because there's so many anti-air, anti-missile units. And the siege chopper, because it's a direct fire weapon, is really helpful because its artillery shells can't be intercepted, and I think it does a good job of just balancing out the Soviet. And then that brings us to Yuri, which is my only big problem I have with the game. While I appreciate that they made another faction, and the campaign is on the whole really good, I'm gonna have to probably do something controversial and give it an A instead of an F. Now, what is my issue with the Yuri faction? First, the Yuri faction I just don't think is very well balanced against the other two factions, and it's just really, really annoying. And it makes a lot of parts of the campaign miserable. So, firstly, Gatling cannons and Gatling tanks are just too good at what they do. They basically just make air units irrelevant. So you just can't use a lot of your arsenal. You can't use V2, V3s, you can't use Kirovs. I guess, or maybe you can kind of use gear ops. You can't use Harriers, you can't use rocket troopers. Basically, anything that flies, you just can't really use against Yuri, or that fires some sort of missile because Gatling cannons are just that good. They're also, I think, too flexible. Like they're too good against everything because they're good against air, ground, vehicles, and infantry. They're not as good against vehicles as like Tesla cannons, Tesla coils are, Prism towers are, but they're close enough that I don't think they're very well balanced. Also, when you combine them with psi towers, which can mind control units, it's annoying because the way you get through Gatling cannons, because you normally to get through base defenses, you would use some sort of artillery, but because you can't use artillery unless you're the allies and you have prism tanks, you're reliant on using heavy units to try that can tank some of the shots and can try to get up close, but you can't do that because psi towers mind control your units. So the issue with Yuri and the thing that I feel makes it an unbalanced, unfair faction is it has units like viruses, like masterminds, viruses, Gatling cannons, stuff like that, that is extremely efficient, that are the best units in the game for dealing with light units. However, if you build units that can tank those, like apocalypse tanks or even something like a rhino tank or things like that, higher value units just get mind controlled. So you can't really use them either. And I was struggling just throughout the campaign to try to come up with a working unit composition against Yuri because it is just so like tricky to deal with mind control and Gatling weapons put together. And particularly for the Soviet missions, because in the Allied missions, you at least get prism tanks, which pretty much hard counter everything Yuri has. You don't get that in the Soviet missions, and it could get kind of brutal. And some of them trying to like get past just the layers upon layers of defenses, at least until you get siege choppers. So I thought that that was kind of miserable. Yuri also gets boomer subs, which are overpowered in my opinion. It's just the campaign itself is great. It's good to see Yuri back. You have lots of really fun missions. The Hollywood mission sticks out to me. Obviously, you have the moon mission, which is a lot of fun, where you get cosmonauts with lasers. There's a lot of good stuff to like, but ultimately, I do feel the gameplay suffers a lot due to how the Yuri faction was designed. And if it was better balanced and some of maybe the more obnoxious aspects of it were ironed out, it would definitely be in the S tier. Next, we have Red Alert 3. So this is during the EA era when basically they changed everything. Now, Red Alert 3 is an interesting one. It's I don't know if it had I'm not really sure what its reputation was, if a lot of people like it or a lot of people hate it, because it is very different from the other Command and Conquer games. Firstly, the campaign is entirely co-op. Fortunately, they were nice enough to give you a computer co-op, which some people might complain about. I thought that that was interesting. My biggest issue is you can't swap. So it would be cool if you could replay the same missions as the co-op commander, because they have different objectives and they control different units. So that would almost give you an entirely separate. They completely changed how they did harvesting. You no longer have a harvester that goes out to a field. Now there's ore mines that you have to build. You build a refinery at each individual ore mine, and they provide you a more constant string of income. I'm not sure if they were trying to maybe copy something like StarCraft a bit more, where they were trying to give you more reliable income so you could macro more consistently or something like that. Once again, it's something I don't particularly like, but I will give it a lot of credit. And I think I gave it a lot of credit during my playthrough for trying something a bit different. They had done traditional harvesting in the previous two games, so I'll give them credit for trying to do something a little off. They also, I think, did a decent job of trying to offset this new mechanic by introducing the base expansion ones. I forget what the allied one is called. The Prospector, Sputnik, and then the Empire just doesn't need them because they deploy their buildings from cores. Like I said, it kind of reminds me a bit more of StarCraft than some of the other games, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And on the whole, I don't mind the gameplay. The factions themselves, I think the unit roster is kind of a mess in Red Alert 3, to be honest. I don't like that they gave each unit an ability. Basically, I think they were trying to make microing more viable than the previous games. Because if you were good enough to micro properly and like with a lot, because you have the jamming units like the hydrofoils that can shut down enemy weapons, and you have rocket angels that can also shut down enemies, and same thing with Tesla troopers and stuff like that. And if you were good at like micromanaging the abilities and had a decent APM, you could probably do way better in the game than going up against someone who's just purely trying to do some sort of a macro build. And you can really see this in the Uprising missions where some of them, like the one where you get apocalypse tanks, you basically just need a couple Tesla troopers. You use EMP to shut them down, and it's very easy to just get through it. Um, Also, there's a lot of units that are kind of gimmicky. Like the Riptide APC, I don't think is particularly good. I don't really know why it's in the game. The Assault Destroyer is also kind of a weird unit. Um, the Allies, I just don't think have a very good unit roster. In Red Alert 3, they have a lot of overpowered units that require a lot of micro. So they probably are the best faction in multiplayer, but the way that they build with one building at a time, they can't get multiple construction yards like the Soviets can with cranes. And they have to wait till the building's completely finished, and just some other stuff. I just don't think makes them that good. I think multi-gunner turrets are awful. Um, the need to constantly have to put infantry in them, it's just time consuming, it's obnoxious. I just did not like the allies in this game, and I found them very disappointing. The Soviets, I generally speaking liked. There were some units that I don't know if really were necessary. The sickle is kind of a weird unit, but overall they have by far my favorite unit roster. I think it makes a lot of sense. Apocalypse tanks are still Apocalypse tanks. Dreadnoughts are way better than they were in Red Alert 2. Dreadnoughts are amazing now. I like what they did with the Kula subs. I think they did what they needed to do with it and just make it a highly specialized unit that's just really good at destroying other vehicles. Uh, Hammer tanks are cool. They brought Kirovs back. The Twin Blade is one of the best units in the game. And it very much helps out the Soviets by giving them a good air unit without, and makes are also interesting. Giving the Soviets a decent air force is an interesting change from the previous game, but it's something I like. So I think the Soviets have a very good roster that's very well balanced, and there's not many units in it that I would say are like straight up bad or not usable. The Empire's roster is interesting. The Empire seems to be designed largely around cheesing people with like Dojo Core rushes or VX chapter rushes or stuff like that. Overall, I think they have a pretty decent, well balanced arsenal, with the exception of not having anti air infantry units until Uprising. But that kind of is fair because they get Mechatangos, which are so good early on. I would say overall they have a good unit roster. Their base defenses kind of suck. I don't find their VX thing that good. Also, the fact that you have to build them in cores and like send them across the map to try to set them up. I find in some cases it is an advantage to have the Imperial building system, particularly in challenge mode, where you could just send a bunch of refinery cores out and grab a whole bunch of ore mines rapidly. But more often than not, it leads you to have just a whole bunch of buildings all over the map that are not defendable, and that there isn't really an easy way unless you want to just build a bunch of VFX things and send them across and hope they don't get attacked. It's much easier with like the Soviets, for instance, because you just send a Sputnik over and you can throw up a sentry gun and a flak turret or a Tesla coil if you need it. I just find the Soviets a lot more simple and straightforward, and even the Allies to a certain extent. I get that they're supposed to have that flexibility. I just find sometimes in campaign mode or in challenge mode, it kind of goes back on you. Otherwise, I think their roster is pretty good. The campaign itself, I think, is generally speaking pretty good. It does have the issue, and I forgot to mention this for Red Alert 1, wherein for some missions I find normal is too hard, but easy is too easy, if that makes sense. Like, I find in a lot of missions in Red Alert 1, on normal mode, it's just insane. The enemy just gets a ton of money and off map reinforcements, and they get higher tech levels, and they're just ultra aggressive, and they basically attack you before you have the chance to get set up. And it's extremely difficult. And then if you play it on easy or casual, it's basically like a story difficulty where your units do like extra damage, they take less damage. The AI is completely anemic and barely attacks you. And you can just build a couple of units. Like when I was playing Tiberian Dawn on casual for some of the missions, rocket bikes were like beating mammoth tanks. I kind of wish there was a difficulty in between the two. Like I would be okay if they just reduced the amount of extra money the AI got, but they didn't do any of the unit stat adjustments. I don't really like the unit stat adjustments. I would just like it if they made the AI slightly less aggressive and gave them slightly less like off map reinforcements. But Red Alert 3, I think, kind of has that issue, particularly in some of the Imperial missions, where there's a. I beat, I think, all but three missions on normal. I didn't beat the Mount Rushmore one on normal because of how it was timed and there was a lot of just really dumb mechanics in it. So I didn't beat that one on normal. I didn't beat the Santa Monica one on normal because the enemy just gets a massive number of off map reinforcements. And in particular, they get a whole bunch of artillery. And as the Empire, I couldn't find there was really much I could do to break through their lines in that mission, and they don't really give you enough money or resources. I find particularly in the Empire ones, they use lack of money as a balancing factor, which I don't really like. And the other one I had to turn the difficulty down on was, or actually no, maybe there wasn't another mission I had to turn the difficulty down on. I almost did on the defending Pearl Harbor mission, just because the Allies come in and they build like two bases, and there's like 6 or 7 production buildings that they have unlimited money, and they just spam tier 2 and 3 units like crazy. So overall, I'd say Red Alert 3 is good. It's a worthy addition to the franchise. They tried some different stuff. A lot of it worked, some of it didn't work. I think the unit roster and the balance was not great compared to the previous games. But it was definitely a lot of fun, and I'd say I'd like it. And that brings us to the last game in this series, and that is Uprising. Red Alert 3 Uprising, the expansion, wherein we have 3 mini campaigns and Yuriko's campaign. The mini campaigns are either 3 or 4 missions, and what they decided was, well, we're gonna, if we can't make the campaigns long, we'll do what they did with NES and just make them super hard. The difficulty of Uprising is just turned up to 11. Like I would say Uprising normal is harder than hard in Red Alert 3. Like I went back and I was replaying some missions in Red Alert 3. Like my favorite mission, which is the second last Soviet mission where you have to fight all the shoguns. And I could play them. Like they were somewhat hard, but like they were playable. I didn't feel like I was completely out of my depth. The missions in Uprising, just the sheer amount of shit the AI will throw at you. the off-map reinforcements, the unlimited money. They probably get fast production and stuff like that. I just was overwhelmed almost from the beginning with just how much stuff they threw at you. To my understanding, it was originally supposed to be co-op. So it's kind of like playing Red Alert 3, but with no co-op commander, and the enemy has the same number of units, is kind of how I felt about it. Like in some of the missions, I think like a particularly the first allied mission, they give you a base and you get attacked from I think 4 or 5 different directions, and they give you basically no setup time, and they just constantly pound you from all sides. And it just a lot of them I felt very much like I was just constantly losing. And if I managed to pull out a win, it was by accident. So then I would put the game down to easy, and on easy mode once again, the AI is just completely anemic and doesn't attack you and doesn't do anything. And I just kind of don't like that. I kind of wish that there was like an easier mode that wasn't like story difficulty. Story difficulty is something like Phoenix mode in Fire Emblem, where basically it's impossible to not lose. I would have just liked it if the campaign was a bit more balanced. A lot of the new units they added in are I think are not very well designed and are lame. The mortar cycle is lame. The allies get the Harbinger gunship, which I don't I feel kind of is game breaking, but also not as good as it should be. Um, the allies get Chrono Legionnaires, which I think are completely broken and overpowered. The Empire gets Giga Fortresses, which are also game breaking, and I don't know why they're even in the game. There's like a whole bunch of just archery maidens, which give the Empire anti air infantry, which it really didn't need. There's just a whole bunch of like random units they add in. None of them seem to really be balanced in any way. And unlike the new units in Yuri's Revenge, they don't really fulfill a niche that the faction needed. Like the allies already have Athena cannons; they don't need pacifier IFVs in addition to Athena cannon. But for whatever reason, they have to have both. They have to have like the two best artillery units in the game. For some reason, the Empire for some reason needed Giga Fortresses, even though they have Shogun battleships. I don't know why they gave them that unit as well, but I just found like a lot of the additional units. Challenge mode is fun, but it's unfair. It's nonsensical. And it relies very heavily on basically every map you have to cheese. The fact that if you look at the guide, 90% of the the guide things tell you to VFX chopper rush your opponent, I think says something about the balance factor. So I'm actually gonna I'm actually gonna have to put Uprising in the garbage tier. It was an unworthy sequel. The campaign was awful. Challenge mode was kind of okay, but it's gimmicky. The AI, the balancing of the new units is non-existent. It's just not good. Uprising is just not good in any way, shape, or form. And I did not enjoy playing it like I did the other ones. I had lots of fun. Even Red Alert 1 that I complained a lot, I enjoyed Red Alert 1. Red Alert 2 and Yuri's Revenge were good, even if I complained a lot during Yuri's Revenge. Red Alert 3, for whatever its flaws, was awesome. Uh Uprising though was the cherry on the shit sundae. It was like maybe not quite as bad as the game that shall not be named, but it was getting there. It was definitely the second worst game in the franchise, other than Rivals, but Rivals doesn't even count. What even is Rivals? It's like some shitty mobile game. So that's my review of the Red Alert franchise. I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless. I'll do one on Tiberium once I'm done that plotline as well.